All right, great. So, if everyone could take their seats, we're gonna get started. I imagine we'll have some people continuing to trickle in. Uh, really quickly, I just wanted to say I think this is just a super interesting time to be having this conference. We've got a presidential transition, and we're sort of we've had this sort of anti-monopoly movement over the past few years, and then recently, obviously, there was an assassination basically of a healthcare executive, and then a very unusual public response, right? And so it's a very kind of, I think, uncertain time and a very interesting time, and I'm excited to talk about this all about antitrust and healthcare and competition today. And I couldn't think of a better person to kick off the conference than Jonathan Barron, founder and principal of Barron Public Affairs. I was just saying, we were just talking how amazing it is. We've been friends for a long time, that we get to talk about things that we would just like to talk about every day amongst each other, but between each other in front of a big audience. It's just a pleasure to be able to do that. Jonathan previously held senior staff positions on political campaigns and with the leadership of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And he's just, to me, one of the most strategic thinkers when it comes to the people who make political decisions, their underlying ideologies, their values, the things that drive them. I mean, we share this as an interest, and he's just a student of that in both the Republican and the Democratic Party. I think particularly with the Republican Party, since he has been, in that world for so long. And so please give Jonathan a warm welcome. Thank you.
Teddy, thank you very much. Hope you can hear me. Good morning, and congratulations to those who are on time. You get a discount on your subscriptions. I've been told by Teddy, so that's great. Again, great to be here. And Teddy, I want to congratulate you and the Capitol Forum. It is really a very, very impressive organization. What you produce is not only serious but taken seriously, and really has enormous penetration. And your readership, are the people who really matter. And I'm just struck always by people quoting your stuff back to me, which I've already read, and they say, there's this thing called the Capitol Forum. Like, I know. And so again, you've really built something quite significant. So that's not an easy thing to do in a very crowded, media environment. Washington has, countless, outlets and newsletters and experts. And so you've done something very, very important. So congratulations to you, to the staff, to the team for what you've built, and also for this gathering this morning. There's lots of places that we could begin, but I want to endorse your comments, not about me, but about sort of the moment we're in. And we are in one of the most important policy transitions probably in 30 years. We sit here this morning basically 30 years since the Republican Revolution of 1994. Some of us are old enough to remember when Newt Gingrich came to town. But what's interesting about 1994 is a man was elected in 1994 who had a very big impact on Republican healthcare policy, and his name was Tom Coburn. So you might remember the congressman from Oklahoma who was a doctor, and he really hearkened to an archetype of Republican healthcare expert and activist, which really has now fallen out of favor, right? So we've gone from the passionately pro-private sector, anti-government, Tom Coburn's to, Robert Kennedy Jr., right? So how do we go from, Coburn to Robert Kennedy Jr.? And that's really an incredible story, an important one. And so I think the timing could not be better.
And I think the best way, I think, to start out this conversation is to talk about the election. Jonathan has an amazing podcast, the Political Risk Report.
Political Risk Brief.
Political Risk Brief.
Well, it's not that brief, so I don't know why. But anyway, it's okay.
Political Risk Brief. I highly recommend everyone check it out. It is absolutely essential if you want to understand how things work in DC. And the last one was I'm gonna mess it up. Boom, the Big Bang election.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Excellent.
there we go. And what I really would love if you can focus on for us, just why do you think Trump won, and then how should we think about the different competing factions within the Republican Party? I mean, I know that's a lot, but
Yeah.
would love for you
All right.
to
So,
take a crack at
all
it.
right. So I'm going to do 25 years in 2 minutes. All right. So everyone, buckle up, put on your helmets. We're going to go. We're going to go pretty fast here. So let's just first start with what I would call the four great betrayals in the firm, and I want to recognize my colleagues Johnny Fluger and Riley Cruz, who have done a lot of work on this. So I am, I'm taking their stuff and putting it in my own name. But the four great betrayals. So we start at the turn of the century. And immediately we have permanent normal trade relations with China were essentially implemented, passed under Clinton, really again implemented under George W. Bush. And the American people are promised 100-0 win for the United States. Right, we're going to get this consumer market in China, cheap goods, more jobs for everybody. China will become a democracy, and the end of history will emerge, and we'll end up living, permanently in South Florida, happy as can be. And of course, not very little of that turned out to be true. Some of it did, but most of it didn't. And there was significant dislocation created as a result in the industrial parts of the United States. So that's the first thing. Then, of course, we have the Great Recession, where the private sector and the financial services sector had gains privatized and losses socialized. And again, from the view of the American people, nobody was ever held to account. Right. So there was never any justice done for the tremendous pain that was inflicted in the housing crisis, where millions of Americans lost their homes, and we can't underestimate how that reverberated, not through Washington D.C. so much, but through the rest of the country. So that was the second great betrayal. Then third, the Iraq War, and if you look at many of the eminent figures of today rising on the right, they have some level of dissatisfaction, alienation created by the Iraq War. Probably the most prominent is J.D. Vance, right? His rise and his story is really impossible without the trajectory of the Iraq War. And then finally, we have COVID-19. In COVID-19, like many other crises, you could argue was great for Washington, but terrible for the rest of the country. And so again, you had people's lives disrupted and even more cynicism created by promises that ended up being, in some cases, false, in some cases, fraudulent. And the legacy of that again has reverberated. So we had these four great betrayals in the first really quarter century of the 21st century, and we're living with the consequences of that. And I would argue the election we just had is a product, not entirely, but in large measure, of those four betrayals. A lot more to say, but that's sort of the summary.
And obviously these four betrayals, or there's been tremendous political instability, right? Since those things have happened, we've had swing election after swing election after swing change election, whatever you want to call it, in response to all of these things. So we've had kind of this constant turmoil from an electoral standpoint. And where are we now with the Republican Party in terms of the different factions that are now, in response to these electoral swings, in response to trying to figure out, how to appeal to voters, and just the different constituencies that have been created within the Republican Party? How do you think about the different factions that are competing for power and in policy, influence, next 2 years, next 4 years?
Yeah. So all of these betrayals, this disruption, as you noted, Teddy, has really transformed competition. I know we like to talk about competition within the center right and the right. Right. It really did break up a lot of the incumbents, and sort of again we're sort of recompeting the Republican Party as the vessel, as the vehicle for the right in the United States. And within, again, I'm not going to speak about outside of the Trump Republican Party, but if we think about sort of the Trump coalition, there are eight factions that are vying for influence in different ways within the coalition. And I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but I'm going to highlight a few that I would say are particularly important, and try to sort of give a mental mapping of those various components. So the first, of course, is MAGA. And the way to think of MAGA is Trump. And Donald Trump Jr. sort of leads the MAGA coalition and the MAGA part of the coalition. And MAGA really is about Trump the individual, right? It's not about the content, right? It's not about the software, it's about the hardware, right? That's where the emphasis resides. So MAGA really is about loyalty to the president, and the president as an indispensable, unique disruptor, right? So this view would be that really nothing is possible without the disruptor, and there's no better disruptor than Donald Trump. So, and again, that's really led by his son, Donald Trump Jr. That's one. So then you have Ultra MAGA, and Ultra MAGA really is the hardware plus the software. It's Trump plus Trumpism, right? So it doesn't just it's not just satisfied with Trump as a disruptor. It has ideological, political, philosophical aims that it seeks to achieve through Donald Trump. So again, it's sort of, again, Trump plus Trumpism. A third one that I think is very relevant to the conversation we're going to have, Teddy, is what is called the bro right, which is really embodied in Joe Rogan, and really relates a lot to MAHA, right? Make America Healthy Again, and this idea of sort of, you know, the masculine, aggressive, invigorated right, which is not really, again, it's not an ideological or philosophical movement. It's really a cultural movement. If you want to understand it, go to any small gym in the Midwest, right, and you will see the bro right, in abundance. There's actually a great gym in St. Louis called Fuel, run by a guy named Jeff Brockes, who, in my view, is sort of, again, in a very anti-ideological way, but, you know, an example of this bro right. And then, of course, you have the new right. Right now, we're going through the various, you know, names here. The new right. Think of J.D. Vance, and the new right is about Trumpism directed in within the right. So the new right is trying to advance Trumpism as part of the intra-party competition. So it's sort of saying, hey, we believe that Trumpism should be the dominant philosophical viewpoint within the Republican Party, and we want to defeat other parts of the party to establish that going forward. So it's really an internal conversation, and the new right, much of it, also called national conservatives or NACONs, they're very internally focused. So that would be another key one. And then I'll just end with the America First. Think of Ron DeSantis. That's Trumpism focused on the competition with the left. So it's not so much litigating the debate inside the party, it's really trying to win the competition outside the party with the left. So again, that's America First, Ron DeSantis. Think about, he went up against different corporate interests, different left of center interests, and he's I think a great example of America First. So those are a few of them. Again, I don't want to bore people too long, but that's sort of a key overview.
I think this is a great lens because I think there's going to be there's a lot of contradictions at times when you're thinking about Trump and decision making and things like this. And I think this is pretty much the only way to try to keep track of how things are being decided, or at least I think it's a very insightful and informative one. And maybe we could talk a little bit. I mean, the two that stand out to me, just listening to you talk and having listened to the podcast, the bro right and the new right. I'd love to talk about the origins of Make America Healthy Again, or this, the MAHA movement, which is led by RFK Jr. Would love to talk more about that.
Yeah. So let's go back to our 4 betrayals. So that the 4 betrayals are unfolding, right, and doing all this perceived damage and creating all of this resentment in the system. And then several other things happened, which really supercharged the political environment within the 4 betrayals. The first thing that happened was, following the election of Barack Obama in 2008, corporate America made a political strategy judgment. And the Fortune 100 essentially decided that we're going to move to the left on cultural issues. We're going to then build support among Democrats, having moved to the left on cultural issues, and we can rely on Republicans to continue their pro-business policies because they're so locked into the Milton Friedman, pro-business perspective. We can have our cake and eat it too. And I think in 2008, 2009, 2010, that was a completely logical and rational judgment. The problem is it turned out to be catastrophically wrong. That, in fact, as the corporate America moved to the left, it did not pick up significant left of center support on its key issues, right? The holy trinity of trade, antitrust and taxes, right? And it alienated the natural allies of the business community. So as a result of that move to the left, amidst the great betrayals, we sit here today with the business community having fewer champions than probably any time in my life, right? If you think about who are the Rob Portmans of today, who are the Roy Blunts of today, they are dwindling in number. And in fact, who was Rob Portman replaced by? J.D. Vance, right? Who was Roy Blunt replaced by? Eric Schmidt in Missouri. These are not pro-corporate, pro-business senators in any traditional understanding of that term. So you had that going on. Now, at the same time, you had 3 other things occurring. One was the opioid epidemic, right, which really changed the way much of the right and right of center voters understood the healthcare system. You had COVID, right, which also had a huge impact. And finally, you had the whole trans issue, puberty blockers, all of that, which at a cultural level had a much bigger impact than I think most elites recognize. So those three things together, combined with the four betrayals and the corporate move to the left, including in the healthcare system, that really freed up the way that Republicans thought about healthcare policy and how we got from Tom Coburn to Robert Kennedy Jr. So just sort of that's the framework.
And, we've talked about this sort of anti-corporatism or sort of not reflexively pro-corporate posture from in the Republican Party now. We saw, I mentioned it earlier, we've seen a huge public backlash against health insurers following the murder of a United Health executive. Um, I'd like to understand this. Do you see that as that reaction as part? How does that factor in with what you just talked about on the right? And is it an anti-corporate sentiment or a anti-big business sentiment, or what? How do you see this playing out in the Republican Party in terms of the reaction to you know you know or is it like I said, is it an anti big business or just a reflexively anti-corporate
So this
posture?
so I should go into disclosures at this point. So Barron Public Affairs is a political risk advisory firm. We do work for a number of very large companies. We do a lot of work in the healthcare sector, including for insurers, PBMs, medical device companies, and health systems. So everyone should understand my comments. And if you think that I'm not being unbiased and you think I'm not being objective, you should call me out on it. But I want to make sure I'm always clear. You're good about that, Teddy, in terms of wanting disclosure from
Yes.
people. So I want to do disclosure. So understand, where we are in the system and the kinds of clients we serve. So let's go back. So America is a uproarious, violent society. We always have been. Tocqueville noticed this when he toured America in the 19th century. We are an unsettled people and always have been. So that's just the nature of American life and American political life. I don't say that blithely, but I think we have to understand sort of political culture in the United States. Let's go back to the early 20th century and the anarchists. Right, we had presidents assassinated, right, by anarchists. McKinley, of course, and attempted assassinations, including of Teddy Roosevelt. And then a period of the 1920s of significant political violence throughout the United States. There was a communist movement, of course, in the 1920s and 1930s. Then we had the instability of the 1960s. And people forget, in the early 1970s or so, there were more than 1,000 politically motivated bombings in the United States. So we have to view this, that we have these outbreaks of violence every so often. It's not a good thing. It's a terrible thing. But it is a recurring feature of American political life. I do think that in the right-left competition, starting under George W. Bush, but then accelerating under Trump, and then really during COVID, I do think that the left became more attracted to the threat of political violence as a mechanism of competition. And kind of think what happened is we had this cavitation in the system where, as the left sort of defined the right as racist and Hitler, right, that has consequences, right? When you say someone's Hitler, then you're sending a message about what is permissible. And once you think your opponent thinks of you as Hitler, then you're no longer about the marketplace of ideas, you're about deterrence, right? So we've moved in political life, we've gone down the road some ways from competition to conflict. And so I think a lot of what we see today is a reflection of the reframing of competition as conflict. And it's a very troubling thing and a very dangerous thing. And so I view the terrible event that occurred last week in that context, as opposed to a more narrow healthcare story.
And when we're taking all of this into account, there's a lot of moving pieces. How do you think these factions, this turmoil, affects competition, antitrust, and healthcare policy? Maybe next 2 years, 4 years, or how should we be thinking about that?
So great question, Teddy. So if we kind of go up to the 200-mile level, or looking down on the entire landscape, I think there are a couple of things that we have to note. The first is that in 2021, life expectancy in the United States hit the lowest level in 25 years. So there are bad things happening in the United States with population health. That is undeniable. So, we have to understand that, for a country, I was looking the other day, I think, U.S. per capita GDP is now over $80,000. I mean, if you look at places like Turkey, it's, a small fraction of that amount. So the U.S. in absolute and relative terms has become an incredibly wealthy society overall, but but life expectancy is not reflecting, right, that prosperity. And in fact, it's been going in the wrong direction largely for the past several years, as Angus Deaton and others have documented. So there is something wrong. Moreover, the system, and I think there's a sense among financial elites, we are hurtling towards some kind of fiscal crisis. We don't have infinite resources. So we have declining population health by various measures. At the same time, there's a sense that we have decline, at some point we're going to face really constrained resources. And that stress, that tension, I think is exhibiting itself more and more. We just, even as wealthy a society as we are, we just don't have enough money to pay for all of the bad health comes that we're confronting. And now difficult choices are going to have to be made, and those are starting, and we see that, and that is causing various stress, various tension, various conflict in the system as a consequence.
And we're gonna. I could spend all day talking to Jonathan. I would love to open it up for questions. Just one last thing. We got a lot of mergers, healthcare mergers. We've seen during the Biden administration, a lot of focus on blocking mergers. How do you think about merger policy during the Trump administration? Is it going to be predictably laissez-faire? How do you think about what we're going to see on the merger front?
Great question, hard answer. So I think it is going to be incredibly complex and volatile. I think that what we see in President-elect Trump is he has a bias toward growth. He wants to see higher GDP, higher equity prices. He wants to provide stimulus to private markets, and I think he's a pro-growth political figure, and I think he assesses his own performance based on growth and even based on sort of day-to-day U.S. equity performance. And so I think that's one thing. On the other hand, I do think that Trump has a strong view that in certain areas, corporate power has become excessive. So we've got this very strange combination. If you think about it, right, it's almost like Phil Gramm meets Josh Hawley, right? Like we're sort of they're different sides of Trump, and they're not consistent in the conventional Washington sense. We're not used to dealing with the blended flavor, right? We're used to having some, one or the other in a very binary system. So I think for that reason, it is going to be extremely situational. I think in some sectors, tech, it'll be an M&A approach. It'll be an antitrust approach that harkens to a Democratic administration. But in other sectors, it'll be very Reagan-esque. And that's going to mean a lot of hard work and analysis to really figure out, not only by sector, but by individual deal. There'll be, I think, tremendous variation. So I think that's going to be highly complicated.
Well, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for doing this. And please give Jonathan a round of applause.
Thank you, Teddy.